Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Investor Lab, the auditory epicenter for passionate people seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. My name is Goose, and on today's show, I was joined by Michael Bartura, who is Melbourne's leading happiness coach for stressed leaders and anxious business people, but he's also an expert on positive neuroplasticity, which is effectively rewiring your brain for happiness. So we talk a lot about that today. The episode was really great, really insightful, and quite frankly, a lot of fun. And I'm sure that you're going to get a lot out of it, particularly in a day and age where we're so bombarded with like lots of negative news and negative sentiment in media and all of these other kind of places. It's really important to understand how you can be in control of your mind and the way that you perceive the world around you. So without any further ado, let's get stuck right into it. I can't wait to share this with you, and I'll see you on the inside. Hey guys, welcome back to the Investor Lab. Joining me on today's show is Michael Bartura. Michael is Melbourne's leading happiness coach for stressed leaders and anxious business people. But the reason I've asked him to be on this show is because he knows all about neuroplasticity and hacking your brain for happiness. And that is something that I am really, really passionate about. Michael, I'm super excited to have you here. Welcome to the Investor Lab.
Thank you, Goose, and I'm super excited to join you. I like your angle on things, so I think we're going to have a nice wrap.
I think we're going to have a nice wrap too. Now, before we go deep into the world of neuroplasticity and all of the very interesting things around rewiring your brain and all of that kind of stuff, I'd like to take a little bit of a step back, right? Because becoming a happiness coach is not a typical pathway. I don't know when you're at high school and your careers teacher is saying, hey, what do you want to be when you go? I don't think many people say I'm going to be a happiness coach. That is not a... So I'm very curious. What set of circumstances had to happen in your life for that to become a thing that you decided you needed to do? Like, what do we need? What context would we need to know about your history to understand how you arrived at this place?
Interesting question. Tongue in cheek, I would say a lot of misery that I went through. By way of saying that, what I've discovered over the years as I was going through, various chapters of my life, is that I consistently went from, being happy in a certain setup or circumstances to the circumstances changing, whatever it is, whether it was a relationship, job situation, whatnot. And then happiness was gone. And it intrigued me to kind of figure out, is there a consistency in happiness that can be found through whatever, practice, understanding, tradition, learning, wisdom, someone else who knows about it, that does not depend on circumstances, and having, the luxury, I guess, of a lifetime of trying things and figuring out and self-reflection and working in a variety of ways, I slowly have arrived at an understanding with regards to happiness that has helped me to then define it and turn it into a sort of a program or a work that I can do with other people as my coaches. So I know I certainly didn't set out to be a happiness coach as such. It's just that as I was moving into training and coaching in general, I realized that that's probably an interesting edge to work, because if you actually think about it, the majority of people, when they want to change, want to feel better about themselves and essentially want to be happy. And yet we usually project our happiness on a specific situation, whether it's circumstances, a person, something that I want to acquire, a marker of success in our career, and et cetera, et cetera. So I was looking for that happiness that does not depend on circumstances. And I realized that eventually people will realize themselves that they cannot get the happiness they're looking for, or at least it's not sustainable. Something else will come up. And that's how it sort of all came together as I was working as a coach and a trainer. I thought that's an interesting sort of pathways to explore, partly because I was also at the time training in positive neuroplasticity, which we'll explore in more detail, so I won't explain it now. But that sort of went really well hand in hand in terms of why am I ending up calling myself what I do.
And what is happiness?
There's a lot of research that suggests that happiness does depend on your circumstances up till a certain point. In other words, if you're hungry, you're hungry. It's very hard to be happy when you're hungry, right? So there's a certain level income even in the research that suggests that if you get more of it, you'll be generally feeling more content, right? And you can divide happiness to what you would think about is more of a decadent happiness, which depends on circumstances, and happiness that is just a state. It's an inner state of being. But beyond a certain point, once you've satisfied your basic needs and you feel connected and you feel like you've got something that you can do that brings your value to the world, a lot of it is a matter of learning how to say yes to what is in the present moment. Right? We have a conversation in our head with whatever is going on in our experience. So if you notice, if you start to reflect on how you're interacting with your experience in the world, you realize that you're continuously kind of conversing with that experience by agreeing, disagreeing, wanting, reaching out to get something else, arguing with it. There's a lot of consternation that comes out of the fact that we think the world should happen or sort of unfold in a certain way, then it unfolds in a different way, and we argue with the circumstances, right? And the kind of happiness that I'm talking about is the learning to understand that the origin of that argument, the origin of that conversations with reality, and then learn to have a better conversation with reality, which invariably leads you to kind of saying yes to what is reality, or what is your experience at least. Reality maybe is a bit confusing here, but your experience is very specific. Something happened and you need to respond to that. And your capacity to be happy is in your ability to choose how you're going to respond, not by what happened. That's the kind of happiness that I work with.
So if I'm reading a little bit into what you're saying there, it seems as though what you're implying is that expectation is actually the antithesis or the greatest barrier potentially to happiness. Because if what you're saying is that our perception of what we think something should or should not be dictates whether or not we can perceive our current situation to be happy with that result, it kind of creates that's where the dissonance comes from, is the expectation of what something could or should or might be or not be versus what it actually is, versus accepting what it is and being happy with that. So is that a fair statement? Because you hear things like, say, comparison is the thief of joy, but potentially, based on what you're saying right there, maybe expectation is the thief of joy. What do you think about that?
I would tend to agree, but sharpen it a little bit, because I don't think there's a problem with expectation. The fact that we can plan, that we have this cognitive capacity to visualize ideas and then turns those ideas into, something that happened, whether it's, we make something, like everything that we use, any object that we use was an idea at someone's head at one point or another, that has been turned then into that object, right? Or anytime you planned anything, you had to plan and you kind of had to expect that, well, I'm planning and I'm expecting this to happen, and then if it doesn't happen, I'll change my plan or whatever. So the problem is not so much the expectation. If you think about it, the problem is our attachment to our expectations unfolding exactly the way we expect them to. The problem is not so much to expect. The problem is when you expect and it doesn't work, how do you deliberate with the backlash of your resentment and thinking about it, where you're dissatisfied with the fact that your expectation didn't work out?
That's a really good and interesting distinction, because without expectation, without desire, you have no ambition, right? So why would you start on a quest to achieve something with no expectation that could even possibly, you kind of wouldn't, you would stagnate, right? So I understand that perspective. How do you then detach your those two kind of like seemingly dichotomous outcomes, right? So I want to have an expectation that I will win or succeed at something. However, I am going to detach from whatever that outcome is, and detachment has to happen in both ways, right? You've got to be able to separate the outcome from your emotions, pretty much however it goes, right?
The practice involves a sort of a layered approach to having an idea that you want to get to somewhere or do something, then translating that idea to an action plan. All good, universe favors action. We hear that a lot in the realm of wisdom, businesses and whatnot. But then when actually things happen and you take action and the result is not exactly what happens, then you got a choice. You can say, okay, well, I have a roadmap. I'm here and I want to be here. And I find myself in I'm in point A and I want to be in point B. Now I find myself in point C. At that point, I can adjust. I can say, okay, well, for me to go from point C to B, I have to take the next action and the next action. Fine. But sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you can't take the next action. And that point, that's where usually we get annoyed. So the idea of us striving to get a result and continuously adjusting our actions to continue towards getting to that results, that's fantastic, as long as our emotions are intact. What happens is that our emotions get triggered, like for whatever reason, and we'll explore more, what's going on in the human brains in terms of like how we respond to the present moment in a minute. But for the purpose of just this particular sentence, our emotions tends to reflect our reaction to what's going on in that particular moment. And so if we had an idea that we want something to happen and that didn't happen, usually we might get an emotional response. Fine, we cannot control that, right? It's a trigger. What we do with that emotions, whether we actually engage with that emotion to the point where rather than just give us some information, the emotion is a data point. I'm unhappy about this. Okay, go and do something, right? But if it's, I'm unhappy about this and now I'm going to be really annoyed and grumpy and I'm going to kind of argue and yell and, sort of like, why does the universe do this to me? I have no power here. When you go into that conversations, what you do is you actually turn an emotion that was just a response, almost like a biochemical cascade of stuff that's going in the body to kind of bring you back into balance, and you turn it into a sort of another thought form where you're arguing with what's going on. And that's the part that you want to learn to contain.
As I understand it, you are a war veteran. You've served in the military. Is that correct? Because I'd be interested to know how that experience shaped your current worldview.
Yes, I am. In the bigger scheme of things, and the kind of tragedies that can unfold in participating in any armed conflict, I probably was lucky enough to, certainly went through some, what would you call live action in my case, but it wasn't as dreadful as it could have been in some ways, I guess. Usually when you watch war movies, you tend to see the sort of the extreme of that. But certainly it was in situations where we were fighting for our lives and shooting and people were dying and all that sort of, fairly heavy-handed side of armed conflict. And at the time, what I didn't realize is that has catapulted me into what I would call a drive to understand why are we doing this, right? So I went through it thinking that I was serving a particular cause because that's the way that I grew up with. I grew up to think that, like if we get attacked, we got a response, we got attacked, so we are responding and we're doing the right thing here. And I'm not saying that there's never a situation in which that might not arise as the only option for you to survive. And if you want to survive, you might have to do that. But beyond that, the construct of using conflict in which two sides are trying to kill each other as a way to resolve difference occurred to me as impossible. In other words, it got me to a point where I thought, really? Is this... Yeah, I have all the evidence of history that this is the way that we've done things for, 250,000 years probably. But could we not do it better than that, right? Are we not at a level where we can sort of move forward? And I didn't have at that age, I was young, I was 20 years old. I didn't have at that age the emotional depths or the intellectual capacity to decipher the language I needed in order to understand that conversation. Interestingly enough, about 20 or 30 years later, I came across a particular quote, which I haven't been able to find the origin, but I suspect it comes from the Eastern tradition, that says, I refuse to participate in the inner machinations of murder. Right? I take a stand in which this is not what I'm going to do with my problems. And it goes back to what I was trying to say before, that at the end of the day, you have no control over circumstances. And the illusion that we have control over circumstances can only come out of the fact that we live in a fairly happy, organized, well-structured society. We were talking before and you mentioned that you're stationed in Bali at the moment. Well, you probably have seen situation in Bali where suddenly things that you thought were given were not. So maybe the electricity has gone off, or there's a whole lot of stuff that is out of our control, and we assume it's under control because it works well. If anything, one of the, could you call it, the upsides of us trying to deal globally with a pandemic is maybe some collective understanding that we're not in control, because we thought we had control, and then some bush rat or whatever it was out of a market in wet market in a corner of the globe sort of changed the world within 2 or 3 months. Like that's kind of Mother Nature tapping us on our shoulder and saying, I don't actually think you're in control, and if you wanted to prove, here it is. So we don't have control of the circumstances, but we do have control of the stand that we take in response to the circumstances and how we think about it, the focus that we use in terms of how we respond to it, the meaning that we give it, the actions that we take. We have control over that. So when I say I refuse to participate in the inner machinations of murder, I'm saying I'm going to own the fact that I have a choice in how am I going to respond. And I might decide at the end of the day to respond in a particular way that might be warlike if it's the right thing, but I'm not assuming that that's the only choice I have.
So in saying that, do you think that we are never in control of our circumstances, or sometimes in control of our circumstances? Because it can be, I would say for some people, it can be pretty disempowering to think that they are never in control of their circumstances, that everything is just happening and the only thing they can control is their response. Because a lot of people, that points to a lack of self-determination and all of that kind of stuff. And then if everything is just happening anyway and you're not in control of your circumstance, how could you ever try and be the better version of yourself? Because it's almost like, well, whatever will be, will be. And that sort of then leads down to, so how do you rationalize that balance between, being not being a victim of your circumstance, right? And but also accepting that there are lots of things that are out of your control. How do you rationalize those two elements?
No, that's a fantastic question, Gus. Look, the problem here is not the actual yes control, not control. The problem is the timeline. There is the timeline, right? And I've seen it enough in the self-reflective circles, call it. In other words, people and organizations who are interested to not just go through the motion in automatic pilot, but actually try to understand what's going on and grow, right? Which is a fantastic opportunity for us. Every human has that opportunity, and most of us take that choice sooner or later. But there is often an argument saying, well, if anything is kind of like happens and I have no power, I might as well do whatever I want. Right? And there is a sort of a deconstructionist kind of postmodern attitude in that I don't think serves us well. So let's clarify what I mean by not control. When I say not control, what you have no control of is you don't have control of the narrative that's going to unfold in front of you. You do have control of how are you going to relate to that, and you probably have a control over kind of what's going to happen in the next minute or so. And within that, you can say, well, tomorrow I'm going to go and have I'm going to have a podcast interview with Gus, and we both plan for that, and we both show up, and the technology works, and we can sort of, how wonderful it is. We can talk to each other when you're in Bali and I'm in Warburton, and we're having this conversation. Everything is fine. And we say, well, we have control because we planned right. We use the right technology. We both have True, but if for some example the tree down the road would have fallen on my power lines, right? We wouldn't have this conversation. So there is a seeming control when the system is well adjusted and works well enough until it doesn't. And we have no idea when we step outside our door in the morning and get into the car or go on the bus or go for a walk or get on our bikes or whatever. We have no idea whether we're going to come back or not. There is no way for us to control that. There's a way for us to mitigate the chances of something happening in the way of that, in the way of our plan. And if we plan well, we actually pretty good at kind of having control. But it's not control because we actually control the situation. It's control because the plan, was wise enough to work. When I first came here to Australia, I remember I used to sort of hang out around eastern suburbs in Sydney and use a lot of buses. And I remember my utter surprise when I realized that you can go to the bus stop and there will be a timetable that tells you what time the bus comes. to me, that was just incredible. How could you plan so well that you know that, because where I come from, traffic is so chaotic, right? And there's a whole lot of other, parameters that impact the way the traffic goes. And the bus comes kind of like every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes or whatever. But you cannot say that it's going to come at 2:41. And here, for some reason, you can. Why? Because we have, very moderated, reasonably well-adjusted traffic. People follow the rules and whatnot. So in every given situation, you seemingly have control to the degree that the system that's been constructed in order to afford you that control is well adjusted to the circumstances. And that gives us a modicum of control. But, as I said before, something happens that is completely out of our control, that has a cascade effect, and take your control out of the situation completely because something else happened on the other side of town. That happens a lot. And we tend to think, oh, that was bad luck, right? And you could argue that it was bad luck. But regardless of whether it was luck or destiny or just coincidence, whatever, the fact is you thought you had control and now you don't because something happens outside your realm of influence. And so you shrink that time sort of unit by which you take an action and you anticipate the response and you more or less have control over that response, and you'll end up in about a minute. And that's the control that we really have.
Interesting. Let's switch gears a little bit because I want to dig into positive neuroplasticity, because that's a big one. I don't know that we could go down this line of thinking we could spend the next hour on this line of thinking. But I want to get on neuroplasticity because it's not something that a lot of people I think know about. It's not something that is, and I think that more people should know about it. So just to kind of let's get into that side of things. What is neuroplasticity? And then what is positive neuroplasticity? How does it work? Let's start on that train.
Sounds good. So one of the interesting things that's happening for us, in terms of our understanding of how we interact with the world and what goes on in our head, is that the scientific research and the advancement of technology around scientific research of the brain have gone so advanced in the last 30 years, say, that we've been learning more about the human brain in the last few years that we've had known the entire history of human beings, right? Because we suddenly can look into the brain. And up until the point where we could look into someone who's still alive and see what's going on in the brain, the assessment was that the brain grows, you grow as a young person, you grow, you mature, and around about the age of 20, 25, on the spectrum between that, within those two numbers, your brain stops growing and he's kind of arrived at its maximum sort of way of being. And from then on, it's pretty much a bit of a decline, actually. You start to lose, I think about 10,000 cells a day. Not big in the bigger scheme of things, right? We have 100 billion of those. But you start to kind of decline and your brain is already fixed. And because your brain is fixed, the way that you can behave and interact and whatnot is also fixed. What they've seen is that that's not the case. So the brain can continuously rewire itself in response to a new way of interaction. And that's where the idea of neuroplasticity has come from. The idea that your neural system is actually not just growing and then become fixated on who you are. It continuously can plasticize, can change in response to new ways of doing things, new way of responding, new way of interacting with the world, right? So that's the neuroplasticity of it. And actually, when you think about it, now that we know that that's what's going on, of course it makes sense. If you need to learn a new language in your 30s, you can do that. You can actually embed new material, new ideas. You can learn, you want to learn how to dance. You've never danced before. You learn how to dance. All of that has some corresponding changes in the brain. Where it gets really interesting is that when we look at how neuroplasticity has served us along history, human history, by and large, it has served us for one purpose, because nature is only interested in one thing. It wants you to survive long enough to probably until your children will have children, and that's done. Thank you very much. You've served your purpose as far as Mother Nature is concerned. And if you look at again like historical data in terms of how that looked like for a tribe on the savannah, that was probably until someone was 35 or 40, and that was it. And most humans died relatively early, certainly compared to how we live. And so the neuroplasticity in that context was very much, how can I make sure that these particular individuals survive best until they get a chance to have children, and hopefully their children to have some children. That's it. And that leaves us with a very tragic, I would say, legacy, in the sense that the brain learned to favor embedding and integrating survival input because that was crucial for you. So we actually have a negative bias that tends to favor us thinking and interacting with our environment, with our experience, with particular focus to what's not good, doesn't work, broken, dangerous, threatening, upsetting, etc., etc., because that's the side of survival that keeps you alive. If you, as a 50,000-year-old human being, that you walk on the savannah in that time, if you happen to chance upon a source of food, like a tree of fruit, say mangoes, a mango tree. I'm not sure if they had mango trees in the savannah, but anyway, you chance upon a mango tree.
They should have mango trees in the savannah. They should have mango trees everywhere.
Absolutely, yeah. We should actually start an organization that's their imperative, right? Plant mango trees in the savannah. And so you walk on the savannah and there's a mango tree. It's fantastic. But if you kind of didn't pay attention to that, that's not a big deal for you, right? Because there will be another tree, or there will be another source of food, or you'll notice it tomorrow. But if by the same token, if you walk, the same route, and you fail to realize that at a particular time of the day, there is a group of lions that is going to cross that particular, because they're on the way to the water hole, you'll never eat any mangoes in your life anymore. So from nature's point of view, your brain is more interested in what's going to go wrong, and what's broken, and what's threatening, and what doesn't feel good, than it is interested in the good stuff. And if you compound that interest, that focus over thousands of generations, where the people who were the jumpy, gnarly, suspicious kind of, personalities had better luck at having children, while the one who were, the hippies, the tree huggers, this is a cool tiger, those didn't have children, right? And so over thousands of generations, you end up with a human brain that by and large is fixed on retaining, embedding, imprinting negative experiences much faster and much deeper than positive experiences. And that sort of screws us up because we expect the worst.
That's really interesting. Do you think that is why? Because, look, I'm sure you would agree. I think everyone agrees. I think everyone knows what I'm about to say. That negative news tends to go a lot further, right? So, the old classic media: if it bleeds, it leads. Like everyone is just, every time you look at the media, it's a bad news story. Do you think that the underlying reason that negative news gets our attention a lot more is because of what you've just explained there, where it's like there is a far greater imperative for our natural systems to respond to a perceived threat than a perceived benefit? Because if it was good news, you'd be like, yeah, well, that's cool, to your point, like the mango tree in the savannah. If you walk past it, hey, it's all good. Maybe there's another mango. Hey, it's all good. If it's a tiger, I'm going to die. Better pay a lot of attention to that. Do you think that is like interrelated? Because a lot of the things that I see with a lot of people lately, and particularly in the current environment, is they're so emotionally highly strung because of the consistent barrage of negative, world's going to end, this is going to crash, war here, inflation this, interest rates this, property market this, yada, yada, yada. It's just got people into this heightened state of distress, effectively. Yeah. Do you think that's related to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's tragic about it is that most of us do not live with tigers anymore. But that doesn't really make any difference to us, because we don't live with real tigers. We live with imaginary tigers because of the way that the brain is wired to kind of notice the stuff that doesn't work, notice the bad stuff, right? And of course, if that's what the brain is wired for, then, if you want to be a successful media organizations, you want to get people's interest, you're going to supply them with the stuff that goes, wow, 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 life is dangerous, because they're going to notice it, right?
Yep.
And it doesn't serve us well. Now, like, if you took children and you stopped them from doing that, and you allowed them to, just grow up in a sort of a positive environment that doesn't elaborate on the difficult stuff that life happens, I'm not sure that that will serve them the best, because sooner or later, right, they will have to contend with the fact that, life can be tough at times. All of us experience it. But it's the way that we learn to interact with that, which is subconscious and tends to ruminate and, really kind of dig into self-flagellation in that context, that is problematic. Because the other thing that sort of happens with that is that we have this particular construct, psychological construct, that tends to see ourselves as the center of the world, right? The egoic sort of mind. And because of that, we usually take things personally, even when we shouldn't. So some shit happens around us, and instead of just like, oh, shit happens, and, if I have something that I need to deal with, I'll deal with it. Otherwise, I don't need to worry about it. Instead, we sort of start to take that in, and we start to, work with this and process and think, I should have said that, I could have done that, or whatever. One way to think about it is your experience with, say, going out with your friends, last night, and you had a great time, and it was a fantastic evening. You felt really good and whatnot. And then today you kind of think about it, and it's like, yeah, nice, that was nice. And, you might even feel warm about it, but it's not actually going to play a lot of bandwidth in your inner conversations, that ongoing voice that just comments on everything that's going on throughout the day. But if you have a shitty time, if you got into an argument with one of your friends, what are you doing for the next 2 days in your head, right? You keep having minor variations of the same argument over and over again. And if you think about it, a lot of those variations try to lead to a point where you feel justified about being right about what's happened, and you're pissed off with them, right? And so that tendency, that ruminating tendency to take something that might be, let's say, negative in the sense that it was impactful in a way that wasn't pleasant, or was disfavorable for your, for your interaction with someone, and you take that and then you just on and on and on chew on it. That's definitely part of that tendency to be worried about what's going to go wrong rather than what's going to go right. And that's what positive neuroplasticity tried to change.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting, particularly in a more digital context, right? Because a lot of people are less connected, and so we run our business is 100% distributed. So we don't, we've got a team all over the place, and so we're mostly communicating virtually, which is like messages and stuff like that. And the context can be so misconstrued, right? So you can have somebody presenting a neutral reference piece of information, which can be perceived as a negative reference piece of information. And then you can create all of this dissonance between the reality and the emotion. And then you play those through in your mind. And so, so it's really, really fascinating. Okay, so if neuroplasticity is at its core the ability to rewire our brain, that's effectively what we're saying. The ability to manipulate and mold and create that malleability in our own brain to achieve more, do the things that we want to do. What are some ways that we can start to rewire our brain to find more happiness? Because if what we've currently got is wiring that says, look out for everything that's potentially dangerous or potentially stressful or might damage your relationships or damage your future or your finances or your health or your happiness or whatever, and we're on high alert, that means that we have wired ourselves in a certain way, or have been, because of the environment that we've been a part of, we have become wired in a certain way. Now, to your point, I don't think it's good to be wired in a completely unrealistically optimistic way, because then that's not going to serve you either. But how can we actually start to deliberately and purposefully rewire our brains to seek and find and identify more happiness, to at least put that negative bias into balance? Because if we had, it's good to have some reference for, okay, this could be a risk, because you need that. But then how do we start to then rewire our brain for more happiness? How do we start to do that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the core of the work. So a lot of the work that I do is based on research and application developed in this particular model by a teacher named Rick Hanson, who's based in the US and does this beautiful kind of amalgamation of his knowledge and research, neuroscience, his understanding of psychology, and his practice of mindfulness-based applications. And he brought all that together into this model called positive neuroplasticity. And what he points out to is this idea that, if you think about the average number of thoughts that each one of us have, and if you go and research the data, there's various suggestions of that number, right? So some people say it's around 60,000, sort of thoughts a day. Other people say it's around 20,000, but it's thousands and thousands of thoughts any day, right? Or maybe 20,000 where they kind of replace each other, but you might mull over a specific way of thinking about something. Doesn't matter. Thousands of thoughts. What you find is that by default, if we're unconscious and not pay attention, about 80% of those tend to be negative in some way. So we spend 80% of our time in some way feeling or thinking miserable about something in our life. And that doesn't mean that it's like the sky are falling and we shattered. But it's the kind of thought that we say, that was silly, you stupid. You say to yourself stuff, or you look at someone and you feeling negative about what they do and you judge them negatively. We do a lot of that, right? And the beauty of positive neuroplasticity is that it says, you don't actually have to go, from the Luna Park to the movies, to the best restaurants, to, you don't have to take peak positive experiences continuously to rewire your brain. You just have to pay attention to all the amazing experiences that we have on a daily basis, which might be low in terms of like how amazing they are, but actually still pleasant and positive and encouraging. And, we have a great life. And so, can you put your feet on the ground for 3 minutes or 4 minutes and really feel the grass underneath your foot and how wonderful it feels, or it doesn't even have to be the grass. You can do it on your carpet. Or if you have a nice wooden floor, just appreciate the nice texture that we come into contact. Or when you open the hot water system and there's hot water coming through. The fact that water is coming into your house to start with, right? Like there's 900 million people on the planet that don't even have access to clean water for drinking, and we've got taps. I've got 3 toilets in my house. It's like it's insane how comfortable we are and how we take that for granted, instead of just realizing that there's all these touch points throughout our daily walkabouts where we can be really grateful and enjoy sensual, comfortable, interesting, exchange with our environment, whether it's through our senses or through an interaction with someone, right? And rejoice in that. Take the point to kind of be appreciative and rejoice in our ability to do that, right? So that's kind of one aspect. It's almost like the basement layer is start to pay attention to the pleasant micro experiences that you have throughout your day, so you tend to kind of over time rewire your brain to notice them more, which in turn sort of reaffirm their experiences, and it's a sort of switching the loop. Instead of this loop that looks for what's going to go wrong, you start to recognize what's going right. So that's kind of like the basement layer of it. And then the second one is to actually take conscious contemplative moment of gratitude, of compassion, of kindness, of trust. There's a class of positive experiences which is fascinating, because the only way to get them is to do more of them. In order for you to become more trusting, you got to practice being more trusting. In order for you to feel more kindness, you got to practice feeling kindness. So look for opportunities where you can switch the natural tendency to be suspicious of the world and worry about it, and look for the ability to kind of just expand and embrace and rejoice and enjoy everything that's going around us, because honestly, we do have wonderful life, most of us, right? Likely the people who listen to this, right, are the people who already won what you could call the genetic lottery, right? They're able to look for, they don't have to work 12 and a half hours breaking stone a day just to eat 2 meals if they're lucky. And we have access to these incredible, rich experiences of our life. and we just kind of, but I want to be, the next one, or I want to be richer or stronger or bigger. All of that, we spend time on that instead of just really enjoying what we have. So you got that basement layer of momentary, low key, but really sort of positive, pleasant experiences that we want to notice more. And then added to that, this conscious, grateful sort of practice of how amazing life is, and and kind of strengthening that practice as well through being conscious of it, and really being grateful for all the richness in our life.
Yeah, and what because I'm very conscious that for a lot of people that's going to be a hard bridge, right? To just say, hey, just notice things more or feel more grateful, right? That's a good concept. That's a nice concept.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, they're, as you mentioned, 80% of their thoughts are negative thoughts.
Yeah.
That's probably a long way from where they are. I mean, you could say, everything that you see and touch, you should take a moment and just think about what you're grateful for in that moment. That's a real hard bridge for people to cross if they are if they're not near there at all. Like if that is a gap from where they are.
Yeah.
So what about things like, what role do things like journaling, goal setting, like habits and stuff, like on a daily basis, sitting down and writing 5 things that you're grateful for, things like that. Where does that kind of like practical application come into it? Because I think the thing is, like you touched on, is really, really interesting there, is that 80% of our thoughts are negative thoughts. Now, most people would probably self-identify as being baseline happy, right? Most people would probably self-identify as being at least content or baseline happy, or grateful or whatever on a baseline. But if 80% of their thoughts are negative, it's like, well, imagine if you could just get that to 50-50.
Right.
It doesn't even need to be 80-20 the other way, but just imagine if you could get that to 50-50. Imagine how transformative that would be on your worldview. And so rather than saying, hey, you got to flip it, you've got to become grateful and happy for everything and destroy all negative thoughts, it's all good. But like bringing that back to, like, I'm trying to think about somebody who's listening to this podcast and they're going, okay, this sounds good. I want to rebalance my thoughts. Practically, what do you think about things like writing out goals lists and things like that? How does that kind of play into, and then how does that relate to the actual rewiring of the brain?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good point that we need to refine here. So a couple of, I want to sort of add a couple of insights into the conversation that helps sharpen what I'm going to say in terms of the practice, right? The first is that unfortunately for us, there's 2 layers in our upbringing or in our psychology that compound each other in terms of our tendency to be negative about life, right? The first is what we've described in terms of like this survival mechanism, that the brain is only interested in survival. And then the second one is the kind of psychological process that you've been subjected to as a child by your caregiver, who, by and large, most were trying to be loving, trying to look after you, trying to sort of take care of you. And yet for the conundrum of how the human mind and psychology works, had their own demons to deal with. And chances are that in some point in your childhood have also kind of layered you with emotional baggage that probably wasn't that useful for you, and you've tried to sort of deal with it and develop strategies to deal with it, which are not really that successful in the long run, right? So one of the reasons why so many people struggle mental issues is because they're compounded by those 2 kind of layers of troublesome sort of evolutional kind of imprint in our brain, plus unskillful parenting by the majority of people. Again, not because they don't love and care or whatever, but how many times, for those of you who are parents, how many times have you find yourself yelling at your child even if you didn't want to, but you just get triggered, right? So we want to understand that this is a lifetime of work. What we're talking about, it's not a switch, right? This is why it's called neuroplasticity, right? It takes time for that to change, and so now you get, so that's the second piece that I want to put in. Think about it. I call it the cycle of intention, attention, retention. Right? So the intention is how you set it up. You say, okay, I want to become more sort of aware. I want to notice more pleasant experiences in my life. I want to sort of be more focused on that sort of stuff. That's the intention. And then, if you think about it, the piece that is missing for us is what we pay attention to. And in sense, we live our lives through the experience of what we pay attention to. Because we can pay attention to anything, but we tend to pay attention to that which we are focused on psychologically in terms of assuring us to give us the best experience under, whoever we are as we developed. Which sounds a bit of a complex way to say, you kind of see the life that you think about. If you think that everyone is an asshole, sorry for my French, then you're probably going to notice the people who are. And if you think that everyone is marvelous, then obviously not everyone is going to be marvelous, but most of the time you're going to meet marvelous people. And that has that understanding that we tend to actually see life the way we look at it, rather than sort of be the receptive reader of what happens, is a really important part of the puzzle here. And it goes down to the neural sensual level of your brain doesn't actually read reality. It reads what it thinks reality is and then adjusts it according to the input. And so you tend to project what you think you're going to see on the world and then validate what you think in noticing, paying attention to the pieces that validates your thinking, right? And so what do we need to do here? We need to say, okay, how do I develop my intention? And that could be the journaling, I would choose specific time in which I'm paying attention in a positive way to what's going on, right? So setting up the intention, setting up some practices that allow you to start paying attention to what's going on in a new way. And finally, turning it into a regular enough process and practice that becomes retention through the neuroplasticity sort of impact of it, right? There's a guy called Robert Keegan. I think he's out of MIT. He's amazing sort of, psychological sort of, in the psychological realm, a teacher. And he gives a very interesting analogy to where we miss the trick in terms of how we interact in the world. And the way that he explained it, he says, imagine that you're driving a car and you're looking at the road. What do you think you're interacting with, or what do you think you're responding to? Hopefully what you see on the road. But while you do that, you're continuously, all the time, looking through something that you don't even notice is there. And that is your windscreen. You don't pay attention to the windscreen unless, you get a big splat of some bug or whatever. But by and large, you don't pay attention to the screen because you're looking through that windscreen onto the road and interacting with the road. Your personality, the way you think about the world, the way you see the world is your windscreen. You will not be able to see the stuff. It's very hard for the brain to see the stuff that doesn't fit in with our already preconditioned pieces. And we want to learn to kind of notice the screen more by setting ourselves practices by which we tend to suddenly become aware and conscious of a negative way of reacting to someone. So Goose rings me up and say, hey, Michael, I'm sorry, but I won't be able to do the interview today. And if I'm wired that way, I will take that into the corner of, like people always let me down. I make arrangement and then they let me down because that's what I'm used to think about the world. And I will see it this way. Where if my intention is to pay more respect and attention to what things happen and expect less from the world to be exactly the way I think it, Goose might ring me up and said, oh, okay, shit happens, what to do? And now I don't have an argument with what's going on. I can't change the fact that you need to, you want to change our arrangement. So what's the point of arguing with? And opening that space in between what happens and the way that we react, there is a space there that allows us to choose a reaction. And that's the kind of capacity that we want. This is a long way of answering your question, but it is an important point that I want to sort of elaborate how to get there. Look for opportunities where instead of a trigger, and your thought reactions being an unconscious automatic process that is based on the way you look at the world, your windscreen, look for opportunities where you start to recognize what's going on in your head, and then see if you just bring a little bit of space and ask yourself, okay, is this the best way to respond? What will be a better way to respond? Because here is what's fascinating, and that is that underneath all that deliberation around, like we have a negative brain that is our human heart, our inherent default state of being, when it's not psychologically damaged or driven by survival, is actually good. It's actually meant to be beautifully engaged and happy and interested in the world around us. And you can see that in babies that are being taken care of. Like Michael Neal is another coach working out of the States. He says, babies don't need psychological treatments, right? It's only until we screwed up with psychology that they need to start to get that. So find that ancient, open, expanded, interested, non-reactive space inside you, and see if you can start to look at the world through that. And you don't need a lot more than an intention and setting up few practices that allow you to raise the bar on your attention in those, to start flipping the wheel on that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I love the reference of, like, the space that happens in between stimulus and response. A Viktor Frankl quote, I think it is.
Correct.
Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom, which is really, really interesting, right? So suffering is a choice. Happiness is a choice.
Yeah.
All of that kind of stuff. So
that is the core. That is the core of what I was trying to say. And just to elaborate how poignant that point is, this is a guy, for anyone who hasn't sort of come across Viktor Frankl, this is a guy who developed that insight and that practice and observation inside a concentration camp.
Yeah.
Which you couldn't find a more extreme example, by which you have no control about anything. Right?
Yeah.
And yet he realized that even when you have no control about anything outside you, this is the circumstances again, we have no control of circumstances. The last thing that we do have control is, what is our relationship with the fact that we have no control about anything. And he indeed called it the last of the human freedoms.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, like, on a deeper level, right? On a kind of like quantum level, our thoughts become our reality, and our beliefs become our reality. And to your point, what you focus on is what you tend to see in the world. But on a deeper level, it is also what we genuinely scientifically manifest and create, right?
Yeah.
So the specific thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs that we have literally shape the entire world around us. And so therefore the space between the stimulus and response is the moment at which we get to choose what the outcome is. And like anyone who's ever read a Choose Your Own Adventure book, they were pretty popular when I was growing up. It is one of those things. It's like a thing happens, and then you get to decide how you want the reality to be after that, which is crazy, because then you literally get to go, okay, do I want to choose door A, door B, or door C at every single time you get. Now, it's a very hard thing to do. I can tell you from experience, I have been emotionally triggered today. and I've been like, oh my God. And I've been dealing with this kind of like inattention, but then even just going through this conversation, I'm like, oh yeah, I get to choose how I respond to that. Yeah. I get to choose whether I want this to be a good, bad, or neutral, effectively, and what pathway, how do I want that to be? So
yeah,
I think that's really, really, really awesome.
Yeah. What's beautiful and fascinating about it, that even the process of learning to catch yourself, how you pay attention to someone, is also subjected to neuroplasticity, right? And you have the capacity to kind of turn that light on simply by wanting to turn that light on, because we have a particular mechanism in the brain, right, that tends to, it works a little bit like your desktop on your, your actual desktop on your computer, by which if you want to access a specific file really easily, you can put it there. So when you notice something and you think, oh, that's interesting or important to me, or it triggers you in a way that is important to you, then you tend to notice it more, which is why, for example, when a friend buy a particular gadget or a piece of clothing, or someone bought a car and you really like that. You've never seen that car in your life before, or you never noticed that car in you before, and suddenly you see 6 of them the next day. Right? Now, there were always cars like that, but you didn't pay attention that way. But now that triggered something in you, and it sits in your current memory as something that is satisfying or worthwhile noticing for some reason, and you start noticing it, right? I have an experience, my original language obviously is not English. I have the experience of learning a new word in English. Now, I've been using English for 40 years. I love English. It's a fantastic language. I'd like to think that I speak it reasonably well. It fascinates me, and it happens over and over and over again, where I learn a new word. I might read an article and I see suddenly a word that I've never noticed before, and I go and look it up and I go, oh, okay, that's fantastic. And then suddenly I see the same word 3 times again in the next week after that. It's like, I've never seen this word for 40 years, and suddenly it appears 4 times in a week in my life. So that part of the brain, simply by us saying, okay, I want to actually pay attention to how I react and catch myself when I react unskillfully. What you find, and this is this beautiful sort of experience with, we talked about the space, like in the space between. What you find is that at the beginning you might notice it afterward. In other words, you'll still do the automatic reaction, you'll still get angry, you'll still get triggered, but 20 minutes later you'll go, oh, I got triggered by that, and that's a junction that I missed. I could have taken a different road and I didn't, and you notice it after. But if you keep paying attention, that space between you reacting and you noticing becomes shorter, right? And then this magical moment comes one day where as you're doing it, you're noticing it. And that's the point where you start to change, because you can now start to notice it before it happens. Yeah.
Totally. I love that. Michael, I've really enjoyed this chat. And obviously, I think you and I could probably do another 2 or 3 hours just on this topic, because it's a very interesting one to me. But I am mindful of time.
Yes.
Is there anything that you want to share with people before we wrap it up? Or do you think we've kind of like covered a lot of ground? There's a lot of meat in this episode. But is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap it up?
I would say 2 things, right? First of all, that in the tragedy of daily, sort of survival, even when you're successful, it often feels like survival, like you need a full-time job to be a parent. You need a full-time job to pay the bills. I mean, that just handling the bills is a full-time job. Then you have your own full-time job, and then you try and keep some, I'm like we're busy, right? That's what I'm trying to say. We're super, 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 super busy. And in the daily tragedy of that, because we are highly functional, most of us, we tend to be so good at being able to handle all those, but don't actually notice it. And then, suddenly you find yourself, running through another year and another year and another year. Like the number of people that I meet around, and myself including, and say, crikey, it's already November. How's that possible even, right? So in that daily tragedy, all we need to do is we need to open a tiny little crack. That like Leonard Cohen told us, right? That's where the light comes in, right? So just a tiny little bit crack in terms of the way we want to pay attention to how we interact, to start to integrate this idea of, putting intention, paying attention, and turning it into retention. We only need a little bit of that. We don't need a lot, right? We need 3 minutes of contemplation in the morning, 3 minutes of gratitude in the evening. You don't need a lot. Don't think that, oh, well, that sounds great, but I'm too busy to. No, you're not. You can actually spend 2 or 3 minutes as you wake up contemplating this. And you can spend 2 or 3 minutes as you're going to sleep, just appreciating, counting your blessing. That's already starting the process, right? So that's one thing. Please don't think that it's a big ominous thing. It's a lifelong process, but it is where you have a choice. Do you want to enjoy? Do you want to have a life that's worth living, where you're kind of interacting from your wellness of being, or do you want to sort of interact from your survival? That's a choice that you need to consciously make. And the second thing is, and I think I hope most people who will listen to this will appreciate, we're actually at a really, really crucial point in our evolution, because we've never been in a situation where the impact of the decisions that we make in between ourselves, amongst ourselves, for others, is going to be so critical that we might be dinosaurs 2.0 in 100 years or not. That's where we're at, right? And so these times are specifically calling us to look for kindness, to look for trust, to change the way that we see the world, because it is within the human consciousness that we can change our experience. And that's true for the individual, but it's also true for the collective. So taking a stand, refusing to participate in the inner machination of violence, of murder, of anger, of all those things, and saying, hang on, I want to write a story by which I shine forth. Really, really beautiful time for us to be invited into that, and always available for us as an option. So I want to encourage people to see that invitation and respond to it.
Love that. Love that. And if people want to find you, if people want to reach out to you, if they just want to find you in general or connect with you, where should they do that?
A couple of good ways. I'm on Instagram, positive neuroplasticity, which is a bit of a mouthful, but you can figure out how to spell it if you look it up. Is my handle on Instagram and on Facebook. My handle on LinkedIn is mindfulness coaching. And if you want to just check out my website, it's happyhabits.com.au. Please do not hesitate to reach out, just for a chat. I'm absolutely lucky and grateful to be working in the business of, trying to be happy together with other people. And so any opportunity to do that with anyone. And what's fascinating, this is a really important point, Gus. It's got nothing to do with that, whether people reach to me or anyone else who works in this domain, right? You can probably double the quality of your life experience, or the 80% that gives you that of the hard time that you have with your life can be changed with 20%, so to speak, of your way of thinking. It doesn't need a lot of adjustment in terms of how you interact with the words to actually really start to feel a lot more happy and fulfilled with life. So, I really thrive and grateful, as I said, for being able to work in this domain. So people are most encouraged and feel comfortable to reach out for a chat. I'd love that.
Love that. Yeah. Michael, I've really enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Good to connect. Thanks.